welcome. Let's talk about politics and governance. I have invited Hupkens and Sophie Vanhoonacker to explore the European Union's experience with crisis and explore the different scales, levels of this crisis, and how the European Union has implemented crisis management over time. I'm Rodrigo Silva. Let's talk about politics and governance. Jan and Sophie, welcome to our episode.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. We're very pleased to be here and explain our research. Maybe before we start, I want to emphasize that it is a co-authored piece, a co-authored article, which Professor Vanhoonacker, Professor Neuhold, and myself have written. And we're very excited to present it here.
Perfect. So Jan, let's follow up on that. Why did you and your co-authors, why did you feel the importance of studying the impact of different crises in the European Union and its responses?
Yes, well, we've witnessed, of course, the EU being in a state of perma-crisis. Over the past 15 years, the EU has operated in non-stop crisis mode, starting with the financial crisis, moving to the migration crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently also the war in Ukraine, which are also at the center of this special issue we are featured in. So we see this, this constant state of crisis, which also corresponds to more and more literature dealing with how the EU responds to crisis. So in a singular sense, but also comparing the EU's response among crises. But we also see more attention to how crisis impacts the EU as a polity, as a system of governance. Amid this increasing literature, what we observed jointly as a team is that there's a lack of engagement with the term crisis itself. So we see more attention for crisis, but a lack of attention to engage with the term, to conceptualize it. So we still witness some kind of umbrella concept. So crisis being applied almost as a one-size-fits-all concept, for which we think it's important to be more precise when you apply the term. So we see inflation of the term crisis, and we think that's a risk, because we think that if everything is called a crisis, in the end, nothing is a crisis anymore, so to speak. So what we try to do in our article is to have a two-step approach. So we first want to make clear that an analytical precision is needed when dealing with this concept. So we want to first conceptualize what is a crisis? What is a crisis in the European Union? And we think this has not received enough attention. And we do so by unpacking the traditional definition of a crisis, which was put forward already in the 80s by scholars such as Professor Rosenthal and later refined by others. So that's what we first wanted to do. And our second main argument, building on this, we argue that one crisis is not like another. Mm-hmm. So in fact, there's different types of crises which also merit attention. So we put forward a conceptual model consisting of three key analytical dimensions: severity, symmetry, and speed. We call them the three S's in our article, and they can help us distinguish between, we call this broadly a mild, severe, or an existential crisis. And this is actually very important, these gradations, because they also impact how the EU responds, who responds, when, and how a crisis is addressed. So to keep it very short, in a concluding remark, the importance of the article, we jointly believe, is that we really provide a new explanatory angle of looking at crisis. And by doing so, we bring together different separate previous explanations, such as those focusing on symmetry. We bring them together in one new framework. And this is important because academics and practitioners, they use the term. So for academics, there's more conceptual nuance when comparing crisis. For practitioners, being able to define what is a crisis and what is not, and what type of crisis it is, and do that quickly, actually also helps save resources and allocate resources there where it's really needed.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan. Sophie, let's follow up on the literature part that Jan mentioned. So what was specifically missing in the research that you wanted to address?
Yes, as you will have seen, actually, the aim of our article has been more conceptual rather than empirical. And firstly, by building on the broader international crisis literature, we have tried to contribute to the definition of what a crisis means in the particular context of the European Union. Also in the European Union, a crisis constitutes a threat to values and life-sustaining systems. And also in the EU, the crisis needs to be addressed urgently under conditions of uncertainty. But the European Union is not a state. And what we do in our article is we are reflecting on what it means that EU crisis management takes place in a multinational and a multi-level context. And we hope that our reflections will also give future studies of EU crisis a more clear and explicit conceptual base. Mm-hmm. And as has already been mentioned by Jan, the second starting point was that the EU literature on crisis does not pay enough attention to the fact that crises differ in terms of severity, speed, and symmetry. Mm-hmm. So what we do, we try to disentangle different types of crisis, and we try to show the heterogeneity of crisis.
Of course, you have both gave a good background for the conversation. What type of crisis? There's different crises, a multinational entity. So Jan, let us know about the most important highlights of the paper.
Yeah, I would say, Rodrigo, there are three key findings that we distill from the research. One is that the traditional definition of crisis, as put forward by Rosenthal and others, and later Professor Boyne and others, actually is applicable to the EU, because the defining features of that definition, threats to life-sustaining systems or threats to core values, urgency, uncertainty, these also apply to the European Union. So that's what we found. At the same time, as Sophie also mentioned, there is a strong need to not go for a copy-paste approach. The EU has a distinct nature which needs to be taken into account. So the multinational, multi-level governance structure of the European Union is essential to take it into account when explaining the definition. What we also found is that the gradation of the type of crisis, like I said before, mild, severe, existential, can actually to a large extent be grasped by those three key analytical dimensions: severity, symmetry, and speed. So we see that severity, in terms of the intensity of the crisis, which we can measure by the degree of or the level of threat to life-sustaining systems and core values, that's actually a very important factor in predicting the type of crisis. Symmetry, the second S out of the three, in terms of the number of member states similarly affected, or the extent of the number of policy areas also affected, that actually makes a difference between a crisis in the EU and a crisis of the EU. Mm-hmm. So a more existential crisis. And finally, speed really determines when decisions need to be made. That's finding number one. Finding number two is that the continuum of crisis, from mild, severe to existential, we call them also code yellow, code orange, and code red in our informal discussions, is not static. So actually, at some point, a crisis can switch back and forth on that spectrum, on that scale of crisis, depending on the circumstances, depending on the developments. Mm-hmm. So that's the second one. A third finding for us, and which is also important to pay attention to, is that building those bridges between the more traditional crisis management literature, which originated in North America mostly, but also in the Netherlands was later developed, and literature focusing specifically on the EU and the EU's response to crisis, they actually offer a fertile ground to join forces, and they have the potential to jointly develop into kind of a new research agenda, which focuses really on EU crisis studies. So these 3 points are the most important ones we distilled.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's some good findings. And Sophie, before we look ahead in what academia we can follow up on this, and I know that this being a conceptual paper, it's hard, but I'm curious to know more, Sophie, about potential policy implications of this.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. We indeed, actually, despite the fact that it's a conceptual paper, we indeed expect that our conceptual framework identifying these different shades of crisis will also be helpful for policymakers, because it does not only help to identify what is a crisis and what isn't, but it also allows to be more precise about the type of crisis one is facing. And this is important for policymakers, as it allows more well-founded decisions on how and when the crisis can best be addressed and by whom. An existential crisis, for example, like the pandemic, which is also covered in the special issue, is clearly Chefsache. COVID-19 could not be addressed by the ministers of health, but it really required the involvement of the highest level, the heads of state and government meeting in the European Council. Also, the high level of symmetry and the fact that all the member states were severely affected and not just one or two meant that there was the need for intense EU coordination and a high level of involvement of the EU institutions.
Okay, perfect.
Secondly, we also hope that our work helps to counter the increasing tendency of an inflationary use of the term crisis. And this inflationary tendency is not without risk, as it may diverse the scarce resources from real crisis and lead to missed opportunities in terms of building more resilient structures and drawing lessons.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and you, Sophie and Christine, you write in your article several venues for future research. For example, the need to conceptualize the term crisis within the European Union, legitimacy of decision-making. So let us know more about this, about future venues of research.
Yes, we all see this really as a starting point. So a conceptual basis, which aids us, but also other scholars focused on the EU, focused on crisis in the EU. Of course, when writing this article, we were faced also with some word limitations, but we really want to test our analytical framework also in practice. So we want to operationalize these three S's, the three dimensions further and make them measurable. We already now observe quite some variation. If you look at different and also recent crises, we already observe quite some variation. And like Sophie mentioned, in terms of severity, symmetry, and speed. So we want to look at that further. Actually, I've already started writing an article about this, in which we'll do so. And also, as you have seen in our article, we apply what we call an integrative approach. So we say perception is important. So how a crisis is perceived, that kind of personal dimension is very important. On the other hand, objective criteria can also be very helpful in identifying the type of crisis or the place of the crisis on the spectrum of different gradations. So we think more work is needed to make these indicators very measurable. And we also want to really emphasize and highlight how do the three S's actually operate next to each other. So how are severity, symmetry, and speed, how are they interrelated, how they reinforce each other or strengthen each other. Because we've also witnessed that the crisis can be existential on one dimension, let's say severity, but it's not particularly so on the other two. And so how do they interact? That's a second point we want to do. We also think that more work is needed to study how the shades of crisis impact the question, the four W's, like we said. So who responds, the timing of the response, when, the type of input and governance of the crisis, so how to solve it, at which level, in which fora is it addressed. So in general, we think there's more work needed to analyze the impact of this on governance, but also the EU's ability to actually weather crisis, to respond to crisis, and also apply crisis learning after each crisis it has faced. So we think that's very important to focus on that further.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Sophie, once again, I think I'll finish this episode with the most challenging question that our speakers think is, if someone just joined our conversation and you had to sum up our episode in one or two sentences, the punchline, what would it be?
Oh, actually, I have three takeaways, but I will be very short. First, not every crisis is the same. It's important to identify whether you're facing a mild, severe, or existential crisis. And linked to this, different types of crisis invoke different dynamics and require different policy responses. And finally, the existing crisis management literature is very useful for those studying crisis in the EU. But at the same time, it's important that EU scholars take into account the particular EU context.
Straight to the point and great episode. Sophie, Jan, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
It was a pleasure.
This podcast is powered by Cogitatu Press. You can listen to this episode on the Let's Talk About Politics and Governance website, on Cogitatu Press YouTube channel, and whatever you get your podcast.